A huge thank you to Milanote for sponsoring this week's video. Hello friends, and welcome back to the beautiful Pacific Northwest. In this video I share some of my favorite techniques for capturing waterfalls with my handy 100-400 telephoto lens. I really hope you enjoy watching. So early into the day, my friend Andrew and I hiked to a gorgeous waterfall in Washington. The hike was beautiful, but after a mile or two we were met with our first glimpse of the falls. One of the best things about capturing waterfalls is you don't need to shoot them at sunset or sunrise. This midday light filtering through the trees was perfect, and facing away from the sun even produced a vivid rainbow, which we're going to focus on later in the video. When I show up to a location, the first thing I like to do is to hang out and observe the landscape. Part of this is to just see what looks interesting to my eyes rather than the camera, and then the other part of it is to just enjoy the experience. Then when I'm ready, I usually pull out my wide-angle lens to get an overall shot of the scene. And here's how the shot turned out. So this was a very clean, simple, short exposure, and the main reason for that is because I wanted to see the texture of the falls here. I decided to underexpose the scene by quite a bit to protect all of those highlight details, and then I just lifted the shadows in post. I think my favorite part of this photograph was that little rainbow dancing on the left side of the falls. After taking this one, I decided to throw on an ND64 filter, and then I switched over to my 100-400 telephoto lens so that I could start picking out little details. And here's how that turned out. I absolutely love the spotlighting here created by that harsh specular light, and I was able to further accentuate that with a vignette in post. I think the long exposure effect here really helped to simplify the composition and give this image a surreal look. After a while, the sun dropped behind a low cloud bank and completely diffused the scene. This is so beautiful right now. My gosh. I'm at another waterfall here in the Pacific Northwest. This one is a lot more calm than the last waterfall. The last one, I was scrambling around trying to film a little bit with the GoPro, and this one's nice, dry, and just a little bit of mist kicking up, but it's really amazing. Let me show you kind of what I'm composing here. So I got the classic 100-400 on here right now, and in my usual shooting style, I'm taking this entire waterfall and I'm just picking those little elements that I find to be the most interesting. So in this case, here's a perspective at about 100 millimeters. And let me move around and kind of show you what this looks like. So you've got this bigger waterfall down here, really beautiful. And if we start to zoom in here, I love focusing on these little staircases of water, how they trickle down, and then the bigger bulks of water in between look really pretty. So let's try this as a long exposure real quick. I'm gonna do ISO 100. Let's try 0.5 of a second, and then I'm gonna shoot f10 for this one. And then I'm also gonna set a timer here, just so I don't have to touch the camera. You can see just how different of a mood you get with that darker diffused lighting, and I loved bringing out some of the subtle blue tones to give this image a more monochromatic look. One of the keys to great waterfall photography is to just play around with your perspective. You can see here my friend Andrew is getting right up against the water so that he can focus on sharp spray in the distance with some bokeh in the foreground. And this is an awesome technique to give your image a bit more interest.
Here's an example of focusing on the background of the falls with a wide-angle lens and letting the front be out of focus. And this was actually shot with my little RX camera and underwater housing. So half of the photograph you're seeing some of those rocks underwater. Here's another strange, almost abstract shot where we're right at the water's surface. We can see the mist of the falls swirling around in the background, where the foreground has some really strange out-of-focus textures. But you don't always have to be right at the water's surface to get a great waterfall shot. The point is to just play around. If there's a cliff that gives you almost an aerial perspective of a waterfall, definitely try that out. See what the waterfall looks like from the side if you can, and see how that changes the shape and flow. And where you stand and what compositions are available are really going to determine whether or not you should use that telephoto lens or the wide-angle lens, or in some cases both.
When it comes to this type of waterfall photography, I recommend playing around with different shutter speeds. Take a photograph of the same composition with a bunch of different shutter speeds. Try a short interval, a slightly long exposure, maybe a second exposure, and then even try a 30-second exposure. And when you get back to Lightroom, analyze each image and decide which one you like the most, or which, variations of images you like the most. Because everyone has their different preferences when it comes to these types of long exposures. Personally, sometimes I find that the super long exposures on waterfalls, like 30 seconds, to be almost too long. It kind of becomes too milky and you blur out too much of the texture. Whereas for myself, I found that like 0.5 of a second or maybe a 1 second exposure works a lot better, at least just for my own taste. And then when I'm doing the shorter shutter speed exposures, I try and bump my ISO pretty high, 500, sometimes even 800. And then I knock my f-stop down so that I can compensate and get a really short exposure. I'm talking like 1/3000th of a second or something like that. So check out this composition. I love that tree on the right side. I may have to try and shoot this. Let's try this out real quick. So ISO 100. Let's try a 1 second exposure for this one.
So for trips like this one, I find it crucial to plan and scout before showing up to my locations. And that's where today's sponsor comes in, Milanote. Milanote is a really intuitive way to plan out your photo shoots, projects, or productions with easy-to-use drag-and-drop features. I've been utilizing Milanote a lot recently to plan out my trips by giving myself some helpful checklists, image references, maps, and even accommodations. And then I've also been using it to plan out new image ideas that I have for the future, like on my recent Oregon coast trip. And then I can take these boards and share them with friends or clients. Being a visual person, I find these work so much better for me than just jotting down some notes on my phone, which will more often than not become forgotten over time. Making a new board is as simple as a few clicks, adding some images, comments, maps, and even sketches. They also have tons of templates to work on depending on your industry or project. Milanote is free to use with no time limit, so make sure to check it out using the link in the description below. Alright, now back to the video. After this, I started noticing a beautiful evening rainbow on the falls.
Oh yeah, I think that might work better as a vertical actually. If you're uncertain if a composition is going to work as a vertical or a horizontal, you should definitely try both, because it's much easier to just shoot both than to get back to your computer and realize the composition would have worked better.
This evening rainbow on the falls was spectacular to witness, and I love how the light was filtering through the trees to create this dappled look. Earlier I mentioned capturing a rainbow at the base of the falls, and I think those might have been my favorite images of the trip, and here's how they turned out. thought it was so cool how the mist would filter the rainbow and create a bunch of different patterns here. Some ended up looking like figures or creatures, while others would just create simple shapes and lines. I kept shifting my perspective just enough to slightly change the overall look and position of the rainbow, and that allowed me to get a bunch of unique images out of the same scene. I also decided to go with a very quick shutter speed so that I could capture all of those little details in the mist.
You know, there's something so fun about shooting waterfalls. They're kind of like the perfect gift for photography because you don't need to shoot them at sunset if you don't want to. I feel like you can kind of shoot waterfalls all day regardless of what the weather is. If it's cloudy, you just get nice diffused light. If there's sun out, you might get light rays, you might get rainbows depending on what time of day it is. You know, spotlighting, sun moving through the trees. I mean, earlier we just got tons of different types of lighting conditions because we stayed here for over 5 hours. So watching the sun drift across the sky and seeing how it affected the landscape, like, you know, a little bit of dappled light here, some harsh specular light there, and then the light would move and change. We got a rainbow that was shifting in different positions. It was a really amazing thing to be at one spot for that long and just see all of the different conditions you can possibly shoot in. And I would encourage you to do the same. Pick a landscape and spend like 5 or 6 hours there if you can. Watch the light change, look at the way the shadows move on the landscape. Maybe the clouds are changing, maybe the conditions will shift. And in this case, watching the waterfall slowly change and kind of transform its mood was almost therapeutic.
I did manage to also capture a few more waterfalls on my trip, and here's some moments from those adventures. So when it comes to waterfall photography, play around with different shutter speeds, give yourself opportunities to see different angles, whether it's low or high, but most importantly, give yourself that time to really enjoy the experience. It's hard to show up somewhere and just get a shot, but if you make a day out of it, I guarantee you'll get better images and you'll have a lot more fun.
All right, well, this was an amazing session. I think I'm gonna wrap it up. And yeah, thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more. And yeah, I'll catch you in the next one.